Well, last week I started a new series with you entitled This Present Darkness, using simply the title from Frank Peretti, but I'm not preaching through his book, so don't be alarmed if you weren't here. If you're here last week, you understood kind of the gist of where we're going. We are in the midst of dark and difficult days, friends, I'm telling you. Now, it's wonderful to be a Christian, and like my mentor, Dr. Bennett, used to say, it's growing dark in this world, but for the Christian, it's growing gloriously dark, right? So it's a wonderful time to be a Christian, to be salt and light in a decaying and dark culture, you know? But it's still war. Today, I want to preach a second installment entitled What the War Looks Like. But this is not the part 2 that I intended to preach. Because of events that have happened this week, we're going to go a little different direction, but it's a part of the war. Boy, is it ever a part of the war. But let's do just a little bit of review. Adrian Rogers once said that there is a dark, diabolical, devious warfare going on all around us. It is a type of guerrilla warfare. It is permeated with sabotage, subversion, innuendo, sniping. It is a deadly war. It's a war between light and darkness, good and evil, heaven and hell, Christ and Satan. Whether you realize it or not, you are a part of this warfare. You cannot afford to be ignorant, and you cannot possibly be neutral. Even if you're not a Christian, you're in it, whether you want to be or not. And then I quoted from John White where he said, you, meaning if you're a Christian, you have established a new relationship with the powers of darkness. Whatever you were before you were a Christian, you are now a sworn foe of the legions of hell. Have no delusions about their reality or their hostility. If you are serious about Christ being your Lord and God, you can expect opposition. And then Francis Schaeffer said, we are locked in a battle. This is not a friendly gentleman's discussion. It is a life and death conflict between the spiritual hosts of wickedness and those who claim the name of Christ. So that just kind of reminds us of the size, the enormity of this fight that we're in. And then we talked much about last week, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 12 through 13. We'll look at many more in this series, but I just want to read this again. Paul says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Notice he says, having done your all, just stand. Sometimes that's what we're relegated to, just standing, isn't it? We are facing forces that I never thought in my lifetime that I would face. This is a war, my friends. If you weren't here last week, you need to go to our website and listen to part 1 of this message, because there were many things in there that I think speak directly to us about our engagement or lack of in this fight, this war. It's not just being fought, or it's not supposed to be, by the paid mercenaries, pastors and staff members, you know, and spiritual leaders. We're supposed to be fighting, but this is everybody's fight. Now, when I say fight, I don't mean attacking individuals. I don't mean calling names. It's not that. People are not our target. Remember, we do not wrestle flesh and blood. We talked about that last week. But it's a fight nonetheless. Now, here's what shifted things for me. This week, the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma came out strongly against Senate Bill 13. We happen to have the author here today, and he and his wife and family are here, Senator Joseph Silk and his family. Would you guys just stand for just a second? Amen. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Yeah. It was such a treat a while ago. As I was walking back just shaking hands, I looked up and there they still, I didn't know they were going to be here, and there they were. So how fortuitous that they are here. There's a lot of fortuitous things happening these days, don't you think? God's in this or what? You know that for over 2 years, I have been calling for the absolute end of abortion. And I'm going to read for you in just a moment a statement that I released this week. It's not aimed at anybody. I'm not mad at the Baptist General Convention or their leadership. I'm not attacking them. But I'm telling you, the truth needs to be spoken. And I'm afraid it's not. Now, I've been a pro-lifer most of my life. You'll hear that in just a moment. But I've been calling for the end to abortion. Now, I realize what that does. That puts us at odds with the federal government. I get that. I understand all of that. It puts us at odds with the U.S. Supreme Court. I get that too. But I've come to the place in my life where I believe I can no longer just kind of roll with the flow and just join in with the status quo. I just can no longer do it. We're not talking here about taxation. Yeah, we're not talking here about taxation or the EPA or even immigration, as important as all those things are. We're talking here about the lives of preborn little human beings. So I prepared this statement, and then I want to elaborate because there are many things that I don't think we Christians get, and there's some things that are used against us in church that kind of keep us silent. I warned the guys a while ago in the room, and that's why Brother Stan prayed the prayer they did, and why Steve prayed the prayer he did a while ago. This message is kind of different. It's not what you'd normally hear in the pulpit on Sunday, but I think it's probably what we ought to be hearing in the pulpit. Obviously, I'm convinced of that, or I wouldn't say it. So let me just begin. I want to read this to you. There are going to be some things on the screen to kind of augment, but this is my official statement that I released this week, and no doubt will probably be delivering in the form of a speech tomorrow at 2 o'clock at the Capitol. So I'll talk about that more later. The leaders of the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma and other groups are standing against preachers and leaders like me who are calling and working for the immediate end to abortion, as opposed to the incremental approach that has been employed by the pro-life movement in general and the BGCO in particular for the past 46 years. I fear that something is very wrong among Oklahoma Baptists, and I believe it is important that I respond for those of us who believe abortion should be abolished, not regulated, until the U.S. Supreme Court allows Oklahoma to stop it. And who knows when that will happen, if ever. Sadly, thousands, even millions more babies will no doubt be murdered while we wait. Like many who grew up in the Baptist church, I became a Christian as a child. Then I felt called to preach and preached my first sermon when I was 16. I became a vocational pastor at the age of 22 and have now been in the ministry for 43 years. For the majority of that time, I have pastored Southern Baptist churches. In addition, I served 2 terms in the Oklahoma legislature and ran a strong campaign for governor on a platform of state sovereignty and abolition of abortion, coming in fourth in a field of 10 Republican candidates. I've been a pro-lifer all of my life. I was actively involved in pro-life efforts way back in the early 80s when the church where I served worked closely with Dr. Jerry Falwell and his moral majority. I remained a bold and proud pro-lifer until I was elected to the Oklahoma legislature. There, from the inside, I learned firsthand the way abortion is used as a football in a political pro-life game played by conservative pro-life Republicans. I learned that while most Republican politicians say they want to end abortion, they are completely unwilling to do what it takes to end it. Among their reasons for not ending abortion, the one I heard most often involved their slavish submission to the federal government, and in particular, the U.S. Supreme Court. Throughout my 59 years, I've tried my best to live a Christ-honoring life and one that reflects a healthy respect for authority, both spiritual and governmental. I have consistently preached from biblical passages like Romans 13 that Christians should submit to and honor those in authority. But living in a representative republic as I do, I believe submission to authority has its limits, and that God does not require unlimited submission to evil leaders or laws. Having done a good deal of research about the patriot pastors of our War of Independence, godly preachers who led the men of their churches and communities to fight against tyranny in the 18th century, I have come to believe that there are times when faithful, law-abiding people must reluctantly stand against their own government. Of course, this type of stand must not be entered into lightly or rashly. It must only be employed in the most extreme of circumstances. As regrettable as this is, it is sometimes the only course left to us, and I believe it's exactly where the patriot preachers found themselves and where we find ourselves today. Every modern leader and pastor should read those men's messages. For brevity's sake, I would like to cite a portion of but one. The sermon was preached by Dr. Samuel West to the Massachusetts legislature in Boston, Massachusetts on May the 29th, 1776. Figure on that date. May the 29th, 1776. What's going to happen in less than a week? The Declaration of Independence. Listen to what Samuel West said in part. A slavish submission to tyranny is a proof of a very sordid and base mind. All good magistrates, while they faithfully discharge the trust reposed in them, ought to be religiously and conscientiously obeyed. The reason why the magistrate is called a minister of God is because he is to protect, encourage, and honor them that do well and to punish them that do evil. Therefore, it is our duty to submit to them, not merely for fear of being punished by them, but out of regard to the divine authority under which they are deputed to execute judgment and to do justice. If magistrates are no farther ministers of God then they promote the good of the community, then obedience to them neither is nor can be unlimited. For it would imply a gross absurdity to assert that when magistrates are ordained by the people solely for the purpose of being beneficial to the state, they must be obeyed when they are seeking to ruin and destroy it. Unlimited submission and obedience is due to none but God alone. Whenever then the ruler encourages them that do evil and is a terror to those that do well, as soon as he becomes a tyrant, he forfeits his authority to govern and becomes the minister of Satan, and as such ought to be opposed. Guys, these sermons like that were being preached in pulpits across the land in the 1770s. But the example I follow does not begin with those courageous patriot pastors. It goes much further back to the heroes in the scriptures. Heroes lauded both by God and men for standing against tyranny. Consider these examples. The Hebrew midwives defying the command of Pharaoh. Moses refusing Pharaoh and standing with the Jews. Queen Esther approaching the king uninvited at the penalty of death to save her people. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to bow to the image of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel defying the king by refusing to stop praying when he knew it was against the law. Jesus refusing to abide by Jewish Sabbath laws that were just as binding as the other laws. The apostles and early Christians refusing to stop preaching the gospel. Believers throughout the ages defying ungodly authorities. And you see all the scriptural references. In addition to those recorded in Scripture, we enthusiastically celebrate more contemporary heroes. Most of them, by the way, professed Christians who took similar stands. We praise, for instance, the abolitionists of the 1800s who saw slavery as unconscionable and defied the law to free their neighbors trapped in slavery. We rightly honor people like Corrie ten Boom and her family, Oskar Schindler, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer for defying the law to save the Jews and other political dissidents from the evil clutches of the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. We memorialize Martin Luther King and others for their leadership in the 1950s and 60s in helping to establish justice for all. Are we now prepared to declare these and their ilk as sinners, rebels, or anarchists for their defiance to evil decrees? Are we not rather compelled to emulate their example? I must ask, is the evil of murdering innocent preborn humans not reason enough to act accordingly as they did, regardless of what a majority of U.S. Supreme Court justices say? If the murder of preborn little babies does not motivate us to immediate rather than incremental action, I ask, what will? In the end, we are either ruled by man-made laws and courts or by higher laws, laws that Thomas Jefferson referred to as the laws of nature and nature's God. Does God require us to bow to the Supreme Court when their decisions defy His laws and common decency? Should Americans have bowed to the court's ruling in 1857 when they declared that blacks were constitutionally mere property? Are we compelled to bow to that same court's 1927 ruling that it is constitutional to sterilize American citizens against their will? Must we stand by while Americans are placed in internment camps because of their ethnicity, just because the court said in 1944 that it's constitutional to do so? Must we accept any definition government assigns to marriage because the Supreme Court said it's constitutional in 2015? Must we stand by while preborn babies are butchered because the Supreme Court deemed it constitutional in 1973? Of course not. It would seem to me that the Supreme Court makes anything they want constitutional, no matter how immoral and unconscionable it is. Without diving deeply into a debate about the merits and motivations of those in the pro-life movement, let me say that the evidence is overwhelming, at least to me, that pro-life efforts, though maybe well-intentioned, have for the most part failed. I would hardly reckon 62 million dead babies and counting a success. I would hardly reckon 15 to 20 babies murdered every business day in Oklahoma a success. Have pro-life efforts saved babies? Well, of course they have. But is saving some babies by slow, incremental regulations the goal? No. The goal must be the immediate and complete end of abortion. Christian faith demands it. Certainly, we can save babies in the process, but we must press for an immediate end to the slaughter. Rescuing some from the jaws of death must not distract us from the true goal of rescuing all. Knowing what we now know, would we ever call for some slaves to be freed? Or would we call for some Nazi concentration camps to be closed? No. We would call for immediate end to both atrocities. I can assure you, if it were you or I who were bound in slavery, imprisoned in a concentration camp, or the target of some abortionist's suction device or pair of scissors, we would not be calling for incremental justice. We would be calling for immediate justice. So why? I ask why are the leaders of the BGCO calling for slow, measured responses to the wickedness of abortion while thousands, literally millions, 1 million every year in America, continue to be murdered? Do we really think more regulations will fix the problem? Or are we simply attempting to soothe a guilty conscience? God help us to wake up before it is too late, and we are the ones crying out for justice with none to be had. That's the official statement that I released this week, and I pray. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Now, I know that does not set well. It doesn't even set well with me. I know this is not a Southern Baptist church, but there are many of us that spend a great deal of time in Southern Baptist churches. I've been a Southern Baptist pastor all my life. We pretty much see eye to eye with Southern Baptist doctrinally. But guys, something is wrong. And if we cannot say it when it's true, then what happens to the patient? We have to say it. Paul didn't want to hear he had throat cancer, but he wouldn't be treating it and battling it right now if he didn't know he had it. I know, though, some of you are going to say, but Dan, How can we end abortion when the Supreme Court has declared it constitutional? Dan, how can we do that? Doesn't God's word teach that we have to submit to government no matter what? Well, that is what people are being taught. I encounter Christians almost every week who will tell me, Dan, I appreciate what you're saying, but buddy, it's just not biblical. We have to knuckle under. You say, well, why? They'll always cite Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be afraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. Do we ever stop to consider what Paul was actually writing and why? You know, one of the cardinal rules of Bible study and interpretation, falling under the science and art of hermeneutics, is considering context, both literal and historical. What are the circumstances surrounding Paul writing Romans chapter 13, or the entire book of Romans for that matter? Well, first of all, Paul wrote Romans around 56 to 57 AD, just for some kind of time reference. His reason for writing chapter 13 revolves around the fact that there were Jews and Christians who had been claiming that obedience was due to none but God, and therefore it was biblical to just openly defy the Roman government because you could just claim, well, I'm obeying God. Because of this, the emperor, Roman Emperor Claudius, had deported thousands of Jews and Christians, and they were now refugees, deported. So Paul was instructing believers that by submitting to proper authority, we honor God. I would certainly argue, I've served in the legislature, I would certainly argue that we need to be submissive to authority. It is a biblical principle. We need to submit to home authority, to church authority, to local authority, to state authority. It's all biblical. But we must also understand the context in which Paul was writing this. Now, I know some of you say, well, you know, Paul was saying submit and was an evil emperor Nero by the time that Paul wrote that. Well, actually, it wasn't the evil emperor Nero, not yet. See, a lot of folks are saying, well, Dan, Paul is saying here in Romans 13 that even in light of our Supreme Court, you've got to submit because Paul was telling those Christians to submit to the tyrant Nero. Well, just for history's sake, it's important to note that at the time Paul wrote Romans, Nero's close advisor Seneca had not yet retired. So Nero had not yet become the tyrant he would eventually become in 64 AD. The point is, Paul is writing this to the Roman Christians before Nero had become the monster we know him as today. In fact, during the early days of Nero's reign, it was pretty good for Christians. So get that out of your mind that Paul is telling them to submit to a wicked Roman ruler, because at this time, Nero had not shown his true colors yet. Now, the monster probably laid within, but he hadn't crawled out into the light of day yet. Now, I realize there are other passages, one like here, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 15, where Peter once again says that we need to submit to the ordinance of man. So then, the unavoidable questions come. And I've been asked them many, many times doing the Black Robe Regiment and in panels and Q&A. Question number one, are Paul and Peter teaching that we must offer unlimited submission to government? Because that's certainly how it's taught from most pulpits today. The second question, if so, then how do we reconcile what they were teaching, unlimited submission, with the examples we've already seen where believers righteously defied governmental authority and God lauded them for it? I mean, Hebrew midwives, Daniel, his three friends, the asbestos boys. They wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, they wouldn't burn, right? I mean, over and over we talk. And then we celebrate all these heroes I mentioned, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Corrie ten Boom. They were all defying their authority of their day. And yet the Bible compliments the ones that are in Scripture, and Christians wholeheartedly celebrate Oskar Schindler. So how do we reconcile these things? Well, I think it's first of all important to recognize when the Bible talks about submission, it does not always mean unlimited. Let me give you 3 examples. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, Paul teaches that wives are to submit to the authority of their husbands. That's a biblical principle. But does that mean unlimited submission? So for instance, the husband comes home, he's hot and tired in the summer, he throws his wife a pistol and says, hey, go down to the convenience store and rob us a 12-pack of Pepsi. Well, she's supposed to submit to his authority, right? So she duly takes the .45 Colt and go purchases a 12-pack of Pepsi Cola. Of course not. I mean, it's a ridiculous example, right? No one understands Paul to be saying that a wife has to offer unlimited submission if her husband becomes a tyrant. I've even actually counseled women not necessarily to get a divorce, but to get out of the house when her husband is abusing her and the children. She's not bound by Scripture to submit to that. In Ephesians 6, verse 1, Paul teaches that children should submit to their parents. Well, what if their parents send them out after school to sell drugs to make a little extra for the family? Should those children have to go out and peddle drugs because their parents said, we're trying to pay off the house and you're to submit to our authority? It's biblical. Well, of course not. I mean, you're saying, Dan, you're being ridiculous. Right, on purpose, which is sometimes very easy for me. But anyway, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 5, verse 17, Paul teaches that the congregation must submit to its own spiritual authority, i.e. pastors and leaders. Well, does that mean then that a congregation cannot speak up if the pastor starts teaching or preaching heresy? Or if he starts embezzling the funds, and when they bring it to his attention, he says, hey, shut up, I'm the spiritual authority here. The Bible says you're to submit. No one would in their right mind interpret these passages as unlimited submission. So I must ask then, why do we interpret Romans 13 to be unlimited submission? It's completely biblically inconsistent. So then what is Paul trying to say in Romans 13 verses 1 through 5? Well, Paul defines the type of government that is due our submission. First of all, he says in verse 4, that government is God's minister for what? For good. Now, do you think that Paul would have ever written, government is God's minister for evil? No, 1,000 times no. Paul here is stating God's plan for human government started all the way back the moment Noah and his family stepped off the ark, after the floodwaters began to recede. The second thing that Paul is doing here is he's talking about proper government. What is proper government? Well, proper government, he says in verses 3 and 4, you can go back and look it up, a proper government avenges evil by executing wrath on him who does evil. Thirdly, he says proper government protects and rewards those who do good. Now, can you imagine Paul reversing that order? Saying that proper government should avenge good by executing wrath on him who does good. Proper government should protect and reward those who do evil. Once again, it's absurd. So the line that we have been fed, that Romans 13 and 1 Peter and other passages require slavish, unlimited submission to human government, is a crock. It is not biblical. Now, should we be submissive and have an attitude of humility and submission to proper authority? Of course we should. But what should we do when that authority becomes tyrannical and operating outside of God's moral code? We should stand up and speak out, shouldn't we? Of course we should. And especially so in the kind of government that we have. Now let me just for just a second here, give you just a few more snippets of sermons that people in churches were hearing in the 18th century. This is Joseph Lathrop. He was the pastor of the First Congregational Church in West Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, you may want to ask, well, Dan, would you agree with everything Lathrop says? No, probably not. Like any other Christian, we'd have differences of opinion on a lot of things. But listen to what he says here. It's a sermon on a day appointed for public thanksgiving. They used to do that, by the way. And this wasn't just a holiday. This was a special day appointed by the governor for public thanksgiving and prayer. Listen to what he preached, 1787, December the 14th. Perhaps it will be asked, is there no case in which a people may resist government? Yes. There is one such case, and that is when rulers usurp a power oppressive to the people and continue to support it by military force in contempt of every respectable remonstrance. In this case, the body of the people have a natural right to unite their strength for the restoration of their own constitutional government. That's a sermon. The reason why churches today so misunderstand Romans 13 and 1 Peter and don't stand up is because they're not hearing stuff like this anymore. Thank God for the War of Independence generation that was well informed enough by men that had courage that they would speak out. Here's another example, Jonathan Mayhew. Now this sermon is from back in the 1750s. Listen to what he says here. No government is to be submitted to at the expense of that which is the sole end of all government, the common good and safety of society. The only reason of the institution of civil government and the only rational ground of submission to it is the common safety and utility. If therefore in any case the common safety and utility would not be promoted by submission to government, but the contrary, there is no ground or motive for obedience and submission, but for the contrary. Now remember, this is more than a decade before the Declaration of Independence. But the duty of unlimited obedience, whether active or passive, can be argued neither from the manner of expression here used, nor from the general scope and design of the passage. And he's actually preaching from Romans 13. When once magistrates act contrary to their office and the end of their institution, when they rob and ruin the public instead of being guardians of its peace and welfare, they immediately, catch this, cease to be the ordinance and ministers of God and no more deserve that gracious character than common pirates and highwaymen, which we would call robbers and burglars. So clearly then, Paul was actually teaching that proper government is one worthy of a Christian submission. It's a government that rewards the doers of good and punishes the doers of evil. Now get this statement, guys. This is just me, but you've heard something similar before. When the laws of men bring us into conflict with God's higher law, we must defy the laws of men and obey God. You say, well, Dan, they're not forcing us to not preach the gospel. Yeah, but they're forcing you to stand by, watch, while babies are being murdered. And not only that, you're subsidizing it with your own money. I was outside a killing center. I refuse to call them clinics. I was outside a killing center in Norman this week, meeting with a group of people. The murderer, normally called an abortionist, came out, went to his truck carrying a black plastic trash bag. Obviously, whatever in it was kind of heavy. It was kind of rounded. And the person that was there with us that knows more about this particular killing center said, you know, a few years ago, we actually did a dumpster dive at his dumpster. And we pulled out all kinds of stuff that you just wouldn't believe. He said when they found that out, they stopped putting their trash in that dumpster, that kind of trash. They put it in their vehicle and disposed of it somewhere else. He was climbing into his Ford pickup. He opened up, it was a four-door, so he opened up the back door and put this plastic bag inside with whatever was heavy rounded in the bottom of it. Now, I don't know for certain, but I'll bet you he was putting the pieces of a murdered baby in the back seat of his pickup to throw away somewhere else where nobody would see it. Now, you're telling me that a government that protects that is worthy of my respect and my submission and support? Our form of government here in America is based on very specific and unique principles. We're a very blessed people, whether we recognize it or not. When the Declaration of Independence was penned, there was a general belief in moral principles found in God's Word. Not all of them were born-again Christians, but they had general respect for these principles. And one of the principles upon which our form of government here, I can't speak for people in Guatemala or Cuba or Canada or France, but I can speak for people in Oklahoma. The principle is that governments, and I'm quoting directly from the document, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Therefore, in our representative form of government, the people are the governing authorities. And it is to the consent of the governed that Christians must submit. Government doesn't have some kind of divine right from God. Not here. We elect them to represent us. You say, well, but they're there now. You got to respect them. That's why I'm calling to get rid of them. I'm calling for us to stand up and say no, 1,000 times no. Get out. You're not worthy of the office you hold. That's what I'm calling for. And I'm calling for the church. And I'm calling for the church to do this. I mean, who else? ACLU? I mean, they're going to come around and help us out? The system of federalism that we have can only function with strict separation of powers between the people in the individual states and the federal government. We all know where this came from. It came from the federal government, but you know it happened because the church was silent. Now, guys, I grew up in the 60s. I was born in 1959, Roe v. Wade, 1973. So I'm 14 when Roe v. Wade comes around, or close to it. Now, I'd felt called to preach at the age of 10, and so I was a note taker and very studious in church. And my pastor, Brother Gilbert, in those days was a godly man, let me tell you. He would have never supported abortion. He was a great guy. But to my recollection, and God forgive me if I can't remember, I don't remember one sermon about abortion. And that's when the battle was raging and the debate was on. And I don't remember one. Now, what does that say? Well, what it says to me, that abortion was never made to be a big deal to me, and it wasn't until I became an adult. And I'm telling you, I was paying attention in church. When all the other kids were playing and goofing off, I was paying attention. Not because I was better than them, I was afraid of God. And I knew He was going to whack me, and then my dad would get me second if I didn't pay attention. But I'm just telling you, I'd never heard anything about abortion. Now, I want you to listen to how our founders thought. This is James Madison, Federalist 45. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are what? Few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Do you believe that Washington, D.C. agrees with that statement today? Not for a second. He says the former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. What he's talking about there is the powers of the federal government. You say, well, what did they believe the states ought to be able to do? Well, the powers reserved to the several states will extend to, and now catch this next long phrase, all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. And what he meant by the state was the state of Connecticut, the state of Virginia, the state of, later on, of course, didn't exist then, Oklahoma. Notice the extensive responsibility of the government of Oklahoma and the very restricted responsibility of the federal government. Now, what did they say should happen if that should ever be violated? If the federal government should exceed its rightful authority. Well, back to Madison. And by the way, you say Madison. Why Madison? Well, he's the chief architect. He was the author of the Constitution. So there's a pretty reliable source here. Listen to what he says. In case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact. By the way, what is the said compact? The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress. What does he call when the federal government exceeds its authority? Evil. Evil. Where are the pulpits today in Oklahoma? Where is the cry from Southern Baptist pastors saying, you don't speak for me? Well, tomorrow at 2 o'clock at the Capitol, you have the opportunity, if you can get there, to be in a group of people and other pastors who've called this rally to say to the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma and all the other groups and to our own legislature and to Washington, D.C., if they'll listen, you're not speaking for me. Your statement that you released last week, Mr. BGCO, does not speak for me. May speak for those of you who signed it, but not me. Alexander Hamilton, not one of my favorites, but listen to what he says. If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority and make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people whose creature it is, meaning they created the federal government, not the other way around, must appeal to the standard they have formed and take such measures to redress the injury done to the Constitution. Let me tell you, in 1973, many other times, but in 1973, the Supreme Court did massive damage to our rights and liberties when they told murderers it's okay to murder that baby as long as we can't see it. Of course, now states are saying even when you can see it, it's okay. We'll just lay the baby over there and we'll make it comfortable, and then the mother and the doctors can talk and we'll decide what we're going to do with that child. Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky Resolution says that whensoever the general government assumes, and by the way, general meant federal, that's what we call federal, assumes undelegated powers, its acts are, catch this, unauthoritative, void, and of no force. You say, but if we stand against the government, doesn't that make us rebels? I was constantly asked this in the legislature. Dan, I mean, if we stand up and do this, what you're asking us to do, won't that make us in rebellion to the Supreme Court? I said, yes. And thank God somebody would have the moral guts to do it. Yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Of course, then they would always say, but Dan, but Dan, federal funding, federal funding, federal funding. In other words, we're going to let the federal government blackmail us. We'll let them murder babies. Just keep sending the checks. Guys, when I was in the legislature for 4 years, I tried to get embryonic stem cell research outlawed in Oklahoma. Now, it had already almost been done before I got there, and Governor Brad Henry had vetoed it, and they fell short of overriding his veto by 3 votes in the Senate. So I thought with more Republicans, this would be a slam dunk. People saying, well, Dan, embryonic stem cell research doesn't even take place in Oklahoma. I said, do you know that for sure? Well, I don't think it does. I said, well, here's the deal then. If it isn't taking place, this ought to even be easier. We'll just make this law so it never will. How about that? I could not get it passed in 4 years. You know who killed it? Republicans. Do you know what kind of Republicans? Pro-life Republicans. For 4 years, I fought, trying, and this would have been the smallest of victories. I mean, embryonic stem cell research is murdering a child. Life begins at conception, but still, it's just a sliver, but it was at least the right thing to do. Couldn't even get pro-life Republicans to do that. But listen to Elijah Goodrich. In 1787, in Durham, Connecticut, what he says about being a rebel. He says, when a constitutional government is converted into tyranny and the laws, rights, and properties of a free people are openly invaded, there ought not to be the least doubt but that a remedy is provided in the laws of God. Notice he says the laws of God, not the Declaration, not the Constitution, the laws of God and reason, meaning in the minds of reasonable people for their preservation. Nor ought resistance in such case to be called rebellion. I could cite you so many examples, but obviously I don't have the time. But I just want to kind of begin to wrap this thing up by telling you that your Declaration of Independence that we worship so much is a rebellion document. Do you realize that? I mean, listen to when Jefferson says, when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right, and he later on says the duty, of the people to alter, to abolish, or throw it off. And that's exactly what they were about to do to the British Crown. They were rebelling. Now, I know John MacArthur says they were in sin. He's wrong. I mean, I love John MacArthur. I quote from him, you've already heard, I quote from him lots of times. I read his stuff. He's wrong about that. They were not in sin. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, I know you know this, were asked right after the signing of the Declaration to come up with a brand new seal for this new government that they were forming. So they worked on it. Now, remember, Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Separation of Church and State, Benjamin Franklin, the most ungodly of the founders, and John Adams were to design the national seal. They presented it on August the 20th, 1776. Unfortunately, it was not adopted, but you've seen it before. Here's a drawing of it. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. There's Moses, the children of Israel, Pharaoh and his army, and the pillar of fire and cloud, the Shekinah glory of God. You're telling me that our founders believed in slavish, unlimited submission? 1,000 times no. Alice Baldwin, I know Paul has shared from her with you many times. She was a great historian at Duke University. Listen to what she says here. Probably the most fundamental principle of the American constitutional system is the principle that no one is bound to obey an unconstitutional act. No single idea was more fully stressed, no principle more often repeated through the first 60 years of the 18th century than that governments must obey law, and that he who resisted one in authority who was violating that law was not himself a rebel, but a protector of law. And I can't imagine a greater violation of the law of nature and nature's God than murdering the most innocent among us. It is my job. It is your job. So in keeping with our form of government, not Cuba, not Canada, not France, not Venezuela, our form of government and our heritage, we Christians not only can stand against evil laws or decrees, we are obligated by our faith to do so. I am obligated, friends. I know the perils. I know that the federal government can come down like a sledgehammer on Oklahoma. I know that. I know that the IRS can come down like a sledgehammer on me. I know that. They could ruin me if they wanted to. I know. I'm trying to abide by their laws, but the way they've written their laws, everybody is in breach of their laws. You talk to a tax attorney about a question, and you talk to another one, and he'll give you a different answer from the first one. You talk to a third one, he'll give you another. Why do you think they've written the laws so confusing and ambiguous? To entrap you. Dr. Ben Carson said he'd never been audited in his life until he had the audacity to stand beside the seated President Barack Obama and proceed to tell the president he was wrong in public. He said, right after that, I was audited 3 times. Friends, I'm telling you, it's the right thing to do. I love many of those people in the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma, but guys, they're just wrong. They're just wrong. standing by and doing some kind of little pious thing while these babies are butchered is sin. But let me tell you where the problem is, really. Now, I'll bet you if you talk to Senator Silk today before they leave, he'll tell you the same thing. The problem's really not in Washington, D.C. The problem is really not in the Oklahoma legislature. Oh, there are problems. Let me tell you where the problem is. In the pew. In the pew. In Oklahoma, with a little less than 4 million people, 1.3 million say they're evangelical born-again Christians. We could debate all day long whether or not they really are. 1.3 million, that's 1/3 of the entire state. You're telling me that 1.3 million people do not have the political clout to stop this? You're telling me that President Trump would scramble the bombers and come bomb Oklahoma City if we forced abortionists to go out of business? Heavens no. But you see, we're so scared we won't try it. And preachers tell us, hey, submit to authority, submit to authority. Paul said, Romans 13, you got to submit to the government. We already know that's not really what he was saying, was it? You know, our founders got that part of it too. You remember Washington said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And you know what he was saying when he said religious. And then you can jump to the second president of the United States, John Adams, in 1798, October the 11th, he said, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Meaning, if morality and religion are not there, the bridle's off. You ever ridden a horse that's crazy without a bridle? They're nuts. The best thing you can do is hit the eject button fast. The quicker the better, because he's going to go faster. And he's going to find lower limbs. Some of you know what I'm talking about. He says, our Constitution, the last part of it, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. You see, these guys got it. Now, here's old Mr. Wicked himself. I don't know whether he was a Christian or not, but I think we've been sold a bill of goods about just maybe how wicked he was. But I want you to listen to what he said, April of 1787. Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. It's where we are, guys. He's right, and he's talking about us. So what do? As Francis Schaeffer once asked, how then shall we live? I tell you what we do. We stand up and with every fiber that we have in us, we say no. No, 1,000 times no. We go to the Capitol tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We stand there a little bit, feeling a little odd, knowing that people are watching us, not knowing exactly what to do, feeling outnumbered and outgunned. And we say what's right. We be the moral conscience of this decaying culture. And even if the battle is lost, we stand for what's right. Daniel and his buddies in Babylon were under God's heavy hand of discipline and judgment, but they were still faithful. They were faithful, and look what God did through them. So I want you to listen to this last verse, and then we're going to pray. Paul said, you therefore, you. It's almost like he's saying, hey, you in the pew must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life. Why? So that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. Having done all, stand. I may get to watch as our entire culture goes down in flames. But I tell you, I won't do it silently. And I will not do it with standing up and saying no. Stand. Don't let people lie to you. and tell you that you just have to submit no matter what the government does. Don't stand by and say, well, I don't want to make waves. I don't either. I know some people think I enjoy it, but I don't. It's very uncomfortable for me. You ask my wife. This is very uncomfortable for me. I told Stan and AJ and Steve a while ago in the office when we prayed, I said, guys, this is an uncomfortable sermon for me to preach. We got to do it, guys. This is what war looks like. This is what it looks like. Now, you know, when I say war, I don't mean guns and bombs. I'm talking about fighting principalities and powers against the rulers of wickedness in dark and high places.